Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. I encountered a Wendigo while making a remote border crossing. We've got crows back at home. In my town, we see them every day. Sometimes solo, sometimes in a group. I am well aware that a group of crows is referred to as a murder, but despite this ominous label, they're pretty shy and generally fly away at the first sign of danger. But the pair of big black birds circling the point across the lake were something else entirely. I know that around the Canadian border ravens become more common than crows, and this is what I suppose they were. But these were really big, too big, possibly bigger than an eagle. And as they circled the point, the calls they made were unnerving. Nothing like the caw of a crow. The sounds were screeching, drawn-out croaks, as though to make sure that every creature on the lake was aware of their presence. I kept quiet from my vantage point 200 yards across the bay, and the travelers I had in my charge knew enough to keep still and silent. We were 3/4 done with our journey that had begun at a clandestine location outside of Atikokan. I never thought I could become a smuggler, but here I was, tucked under ancient white pines with a man and woman who were essentially strangers to me. They watched the huge birds with me, whispering back and forth in their native language. I don't know what they were saying, but the look in their eyes showed their fear. And these people have seen things in their homeland bad enough for them to leave with nothing more than a few possessions, and then give all of their money to a stranger who arranged for me to take them through the wilderness to cross the most remote section of the largest unguarded border in the world. Traveling by canoe along a route that my ancestors have traveled since long before there was a border, we had crossed the imaginary line last night. And by this time tomorrow I planned to load them into a van that would be waiting at a trailhead near Ely. This was where we would part ways. For now we were preparing to break camp at a campsite known only to me. I carved it out of the timber a few years ago, and it is able to conceal not only a tent, but a canoe as well. There's not much canoe traffic this time of year, but I was doing a final check to make sure the coast was clear when the birds showed up. Figuring there must be something along the shore holding their interest, I fished my binoculars out of my pack to get a closer look at the sinister pair. To the naked eye, it looked like a typical rocky point on a shield lake. A smooth rock shoreline gave way to a stand of sparse bulrushes with a couple of boulders. One of the boulders didn't look right. I realized that I was actually looking at a dead moose that had floated up there. Likely a casualty from the moose season that ended the week before. That explained why the pair of birds were circling, and I pulled the binoculars away to study how the birds were behaving. They took turns swooping down low over the moose and then soaring higher than the treetops and letting out their disturbing calls. Then there was movement in the trees. I pulled the binoculars back up and focused in on the mix of birch and fir that was along the shoreline. At first, I thought it was a bear coming down to take advantage of the dead moose. But this was far taller than a bear. Then I saw the antlers. Some smaller trees parted, and then what at first I thought was a moose stepped to the water's edge. I've seen hundreds of moose in my time up here, but what I was seeing now didn't make sense. Sure, it had antlers, and it was tall like a moose. But it was mostly without fur, and the color was all wrong. More of a sickly pinkish gray than the dark brown you would expect of a moose. I could see its ribs. And its front legs weren't really legs. They were more like long, gangly arms. Arms that ended in long, bony fingers. Even though I was about 200 yards away, I could see the glint of fangs. It stepped from the trees to the water's edge. It paused and looked up at the circling birds. It let out a scream that hung in the air. One of my travelers let out a whimper, and I turned, put a raised finger across my lips. I knew we were out of sight of what any typical animal or person could see, but this was far from typical. I flashed back to many years before when I stared wide-eyed at my grandfather as he told stories around the campfire. Flames flickered and birch logs crackled as he described an evil spirit called the Wendigo. Many generations ago, a lost hunter turned to cannibalism to survive, and his evil deed transformed him into a horrific beast. A beast that roamed the wilds with an insatiable hunger for flesh, human or otherwise. While this story terrified me as a child, I never gave it any thought as an adult, as the elders had many tales of spirits and such. But here I was, miles from the nearest road, two strangers in my care, looking at the impossible. I subconsciously reached to feel the outline of my revolver tucked into the back of my pants. The beast had now waded into the water, and its claws began tearing at the moose carcass. It ripped off huge chunks of flesh, hide, and bone with ease, shoving them into his gaping mouth where they were crunched and swallowed. The water around the moose carcass was soon tinged red with blood, and the pair of giant birds took roost in a tall pine above the beast. The carnage continued as the creature consumed impossible amounts in minutes. I heard one of the travelers whisper Monstoro. I didn't need translation to know what it meant. They had every reason to be scared now. I've had face-to-face standoffs with wild bears, with big city gangs, with angry fathers. At least with those you have an idea of what you are dealing with. My grandfather never said how one would deal with a Wendigo. With most of the moose consumed, the monster let out another scream. I was back to looking through binoculars, which was a mistake as the beast's face and chest were covered in blood, and flesh clung to its claws. An image I will never be able to erase. Despite having consumed the better part of an adult moose, it was still gone in appearance. It took a last look around, and I stopped breathing when its gaze seemed to focus on our location for a moment. It slowly turned towards shore and then disappeared into the brush. This cued the black birds to come down for what was left. One bird rested on the moose's hindquarter and picked away at intestines. The other rested on the head and feasted on the eyes and torn open neck. After a few minutes, they flew up silently, circled over our location, and then headed in the general direction the Wendigo had gone. At least they went in the opposite direction we were headed. We sat in silence for a time, then I pulled out a map. I showed the travelers where we were, where the Wendigo had gone, and where we needed to go to complete the journey. I showed them my gun, which I had kept hidden from them until now, hoping it would ease their fears. It didn't do much to ease my fears. It was a .357 revolver, enough to stop a bear, but what would it do to a Wendigo? I suspected there needed to be some version of a silver bullet to stop an evil spirit. I gestured to them to pack their belongings, which they did quickly and quietly. I calculated that if we traveled lightly and quickly, we could be out by nightfall. I decided to leave the tent and everything else not essential. We slid the canoe down the bank, climbed in, and pushed off. The woman sat on the floor in the middle. The man was at the bow. I paddled from the stern with intensity. We had about 10 miles to the end of the lake. At the end of the lake was a portage trail of about a half-mile that would bring us to the next lake. We had done a number of portages already on this trip, and after the morning's events I was dreading having to be on foot. There was no other way out. A light wind was at our back, allowing for relatively quick travel. The man was paddling as best he could, but it was marginally helpful at best. The woman kept her head down and did not move. Usually on this kind of trip, I try to hug the shoreline to keep a low profile, but now we were tracking right down the middle of the lake. I was making a beeline for a height of land where I knew the portage was, and we continued along in silence. The paddle down the long lake was uneventful, and it was early afternoon when we reached the portage. Once ashore, we took a short break and ate some jerky, and then it was time to make the portage. It would be easier now since I had abandoned most of the gear. On earlier portages, I had the travelers hide out while I scouted ahead to make sure we would not meet anyone on the trail, but there was no time for that. I think they understood me as I tried to explain the importance of moving quickly and quietly. I pointed to the trail and then to the packs and paddles. They took the cue, and I put the canoe up on my shoulders, and we plodded along through the forest. It took less than an hour to get to the next lake. There was a forest fire here several years before, and the charred remains of a few old-growth pine stood in stark contrast to the young aspen, birch, and spruce that had grown in the void left by the fire. This lake was smaller, with many bays and points, and we were soon back to making progress in the canoe. 25, we came around a point midway down the lake. I looked to the end of the lake where we would find the next portage and stopped paddling. Maybe 300 yards away was the remains of a burnt pine. Roosting in the tree were two birds. Big, black birds. The man in the bow saw them too and muttered something to the woman. She looked up for the first time and stifled a scream. We had to go past them to get to the next portage, so I kept paddling down the middle, not taking my eyes off the birds. As we got closer, it was obvious they were watching us too, their heads pivoting as we passed them. I kept looking back over my shoulder at them, but they held their position. I didn't know what the presence of the birds on our route signified, but based on what I saw this morning, it couldn't be good. By the time we were at the end of lake where the next portage was, I could barely make out the tree anymore. I thought that perhaps we were in the clear, but then we all heard the unmistakable sound, the same sound we heard the birds making this morning. Even though they had to be over a mile away, there was no mistaking it. The long, drawn-out croaking continued for a minute, then it was silent again. I paddled towards shore so hard that the bow slid 2 feet onto the bank. Go, 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 I yelled. The travelers seemed shocked at my yelling, as I had not said anything to them in the few days we had been together that wasn't a whisper. They both scrambled out of the canoe, grabbed the gear, and headed up the path. I again wrestled the canoe onto my shoulders and followed. We still had another lake to cross after this portage. Then it was down a creek to where we were to be picked up in a remote parking lot at the end of a forest road. We would be early, but maybe I could get a cell phone signal and get a call or text to the driver. Or maybe we could hitch a ride with a tourist. Any concerns of being intercepted by authorities has now taken a back seat to getting out of here and away from that thing that for all I knew was making its way south toward us. Since we were closer to an access point, this mile-long portage was well traveled and we made good time. The first half was up a slight incline. Then it went down much more steeply to the next lake. We reached the top and paused for a quick rest. I set the canoe down to catch my breath. The crest of the trail allowed a good view of the valley ahead. It also allowed a good view of 2 huge, black birds that were circling above the treetops. The woman was not able to stifle her scream this time, and this prompted the birds to start up with their ominous calls. In the distance, we heard another sound. It was a scream that could have only come from the horror we had seen this morning. While I felt a certain amount of responsibility to the travelers, my concern for them was waning. You better keep up, I yelled as hoisted the canoe back onto my shoulders. I headed down the steep trail as fast as I could, and I could hear the travelers behind me, stumbling, but not falling too far behind. With the canoe on my shoulders, I couldn't see if they were carrying the paddles. Didn't matter. I keep a spare strap to the supports in the canoe. The steep path made a switchback and was able to see that the man was indeed carrying a paddle and pack. The woman was crying hysterically, carrying nothing. The path here was steep and rough, with many large rocks and roots creating potential tripping hazards. The birds were circling overhead us now, their croaks echoing off the hillside. We heard the distant scream again, although this time it didn't sound so distant. It was not possible for us to move any faster, but I took care to be sure-footed. I could see we were nearly to the bottom of the hill. Once there, it would be level ground to the next lake, which was now only a few hundred yards away. I made it to the bottom of the hill where the well-worn path went through a series of large roots and then turned to dirt. Once to the dirt, I flipped the canoe off my shoulders and let it land on the hull. The travelers were coming up 50 yards behind me. I grabbed the bow of the canoe and started dragging it, hoping the man would catch up and grab the stern. I started to yell at the couple to hurry, but I was interrupted by another scream from the beast. It was coming from our right, and I could now hear branches breaking and what sounded like breathing and snarling. There was no reason to think that the lake would offer refuge from this thing, but it seemed like a better option than facing it here on the path. The man was almost caught up to me, but he stopped to see where his partner was. She had tripped on a root and was now screaming, not sure if it was in pain or terror. Probably more terror, as the Wendigo had broken through the brush along the trail and was now 50 feet behind her. She looked back at it and let out what she meant to be a scream, but came out as a yelp. The beast was on her in seconds, and it picked her up over its head and slammed her to the ground. The man dropped to his knees, watching in horror as his partner was torn apart and devoured. Wendy 8, I resumed dragging the canoe as fast as I could, not looking back. The beast let out another shriek. Then there was a scream that I presumed to be from the man. I tried not to think about the snapping and crunching sounds I could hear from behind me. The next lake was now in sight, and even though my entire body wanted to quit, I was now running. The shoreline was sandy and I ran right into the water, allowing the canoe to float past me. I hopped in when the back sea was even with me, and in one motion pulled the tag end of the knot that held my spare paddle in place. A few quick strokes, and I was 20 yards from shore. The screams of the beast continued, and the black birds that had been watching the bloodbath from treetops now were starting to swoop around me, getting closer with each pass. The Wendigo was now on the shoreline, and it let out the loudest scream of all. It stepped in the water to its knees but stopped, gesturing with its long arms and howling at the sky. Not knowing what to do next, I pulled out my revolver. At the end of this lake was the outlet stream that would lead me to a bridge. For the moment, I felt safer where I was. The birds were getting ever bolder, and I could feel the wind as one of them swooped in on me from behind my shoulder. It wheeled around over the bow and came right back at me. It reared back at arm's length with its wings spread and its talons coming right at my face. Taking advantage of a perfect opportunity, one pointed the gun barrel at the bird's center and pulled the trigger. Black feathers flew, and the now silenced bird landed in the water and strangely sank out of sight. The other bird flew up high and then quickly descended, coming right at me. I had the gun raised, but the bird did not offer a good target, and it flew past my head. Sensing weakness, it circled around and attacked, pecking me on the back of the head with its massive beak. I had to be careful not to tip as I tried to fend it off with the paddle. More determined than ever, the bird came back at me. I fired twice, missing both times. With 3 rounds left in the gun, I knew I better choose my next shots carefully. The bird came from behind me again. This time it wheeled around quickly, planting its talons on my chest and pecking at my eyes. My attempts to fend it off with a fist were not successful, and it got a hold of my eyebrow. I could feel flesh pulling away from my skull, and I pointed the gun right at it, and even though I thought the barrel was pressed right into it, I still missed. I resorted to using the gun as a bludgeon that I slammed into its neck. This had a noticeable effect. It let out a deep croak and let go its grip. I was not watching the Wendigo at this point, focused on the dark feathered assailant. I could hear it, though, as it let out shrieks and screams louder than a siren. The remaining black bird shook up some from the pistol whipping, flew in a crooked path now, obviously having difficulty maintaining its course. I felt confident I could take it down with one of my remaining rounds. It came straight at me. I let it peck the top of my head as it went by. It circled around again, and once more I let it get me with a good peck to my temple. It made another loop around, and I was ready when it followed the same path of attack. It came right at me, and I was looking down the barrel right at the bird's head when I pulled the trigger. The raven's head disintegrated in a cloud of black feathers and blood, and the headless body landed at my feet, wings still flapping, talons still grasping. The shrieks of the Wendigo suddenly stopped. It stood motionless, staring out at the lake, not necessarily at me. I set the gun on the seat next to me. There was still one round left. I used the paddle as a shovel to lift the dead bird over the side and into the lake, where it too strangely sank out of sight. The Wendigo, while still a fearsome-looking beast with its face and claws covered in blood and flesh, had lost its menacing posture. I pointed the revolver at it, right at its head. I was confident I could hit it, not confident that my one remaining bullet would kill it. For some reason I thought about the old saying that if carrying a handgun for bear protection, you should save the last round for yourself. Pretty sure the old saying applies here. I lowered the gun and watched the beast. With its long bony arms hanging at its sides, it turned towards shore, and with 2 big steps it was crashing through the timber, heading away from the lake, away from me, away from my exit point. I sat quietly for a minute, trying to take all of this in. I could no longer hear the sounds of branches breaking. Was the Wendigo gone? Apparently they can't or won't swim. The ravens must act as seers or scouts for the Wendigo. Once they were eliminated, it was like a switch was flipped. I thought about the hapless travelers. I knew it was pointless to go back to where I had last seen them. What would happen to me when I left the lake? It was now late in the afternoon. I slid the revolver with its 1 bullet into the back of my jeans, picked up the paddle, and headed for the outlet creek. Second story. I am a psychologist. My patient has Wendigo psychosis. John had been my patient for months. I couldn't label him using official DSM codes, but he appeared to have what is known as Wendigo psychosis. At the time of my initial assessment, there wasn't any direct evidence that he tasted human flesh, although I could tell it was a significant preoccupation with him and suspected him in the creation of several recent grisly scenes. "Just admiring the artwork in your office," John said to me one day. He grinned, letting me see the teeth he filed down to fine points. "So much red. I wonder if we're alike, you and I." I swallowed nervously. I couldn't report his Wendigo psychosis to the authorities, though, because I would be perceived to be just as crazy as him. I couldn't even say he's a cannibal, even though he's come out and said his greatest fantasy is to devour a person over the course of 3 days. There was no proof. "So much red," John repeated, "like a sea of blood making its way to your kitchen table." He grinned again, seeming even more unstable. "This has to stop, John. Right now, there's no direct evidence linking you to the murders, but if you keep eating people, your actions will eventually catch up to you. You haven't reported me yet. No evidence. No, I think it's because you like me. Deep down, you like me, David Morrison. Why? Why the hell would I like someone like you? I can't prove it, but I know you are a murderer. Not just that, a monster." John put a hand admiringly to his heart. "You really think that about me?" "Yes, I do. I'd like to talk about your parents, John." My session with him ended a few minutes later, and I drove to the park, taking in the beauty of summer before heading home. My wife had gone on a business trip, so I had the place to myself. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. I popped on the TV. Hannibal was on, but I stopped myself from changing the channel. For some reason, I had become intrigued by monsters. For some reason, I shook my head. The reason was clear. John. I put dinner in the oven, a chicken stuffed with carrots and onions. While that cooked, I decided to go into the basement, do some late spring cleaning. Turning on the light, I surveyed the pile of unruly boxes. A few cocoons struggled as they hung from the ceiling. Their inner cores were human, weak from neuroses or traumatic life events to the extent that they were willing to visit a lonely psychologist's house for free therapy. "You're happier this way," I said. "And you called me a monster," John replied for the cocoon of silk. I turned around, greeting John's sharp teeth and blood-red eyes. He looked like a droopy-eyed hunting dog. "Did you come to eat me, John?" John hesitated, then shook his head. "No. I'm here to learn from you. From the master. You've obviously found a perfect way to ensnare your victims. Teach me." So I showed John how I spun a spider's web from my own hands. I was afraid he would eat me at first, and even though he stared at me with those hungry, blood-red eyes, he left with a cocoon of silk over his left shoulder. The Wendigo told me later that he could give me the hunger, the fire in my gut which would illuminate the path of my soul. I asked who had sent him. He told me John did, because he was so very grateful for the bundle of human flesh I gave him. "A gift for a gift," the Wendigo said, disappearing into the basement gloom and leaving me alone with my thoughts. Third story. Be warned, there are bad people who live in the woods. Have you guys ever seen the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? Many of you probably have, but for those who haven't, it's your run-of-the-mill slasher horror flick made in the 1970s, I think. Hold on, let me check. Yeah, that's right, 1974. It's considered one of the best horror films ever made. When I first watched it, it seemed to really hit home for me, much more than it did for my brothers when we were younger. I was 11 at the time, and we had sneaked a copy of it into our house from our friend who lent it to us at the time. Now, I would have to say one of my biggest fears is being kidnapped and being surrounded by inbred, bat-hit crazy people. So needless to say, when I saw this, there were more than a few sleepless nights with my light on. But did you know it was based on a true story? Just the thought that there were real, actual lunatics like that in the world just made my stomach churn. But what are the chances that you would ever find yourself in a situation like that? Let me tell you all, and this post will serve as a warning to anyone who thinks that the United States doesn't still have its fair share of crazies. Listen to me right now. There are people out there who live in the woods. There are many of them, and I would bet that there are some that live in your state. And they are possibly the most dangerous and bat-hit crazy people you will ever encounter. They are not to be tampered with. If they find you on their turf, and God forbid capture you, then you might as well be better dead. When groups of people begin to isolate themselves for a long time, many of whom participate in interbreeding, they become something much more different than a human. Their primal instincts and violent tendencies become amplified, as well as their intelligence and empathy becoming non-existent. So no sleep. I would like to tell you about my most terrifying experience and my first and hopefully last encounter with these people. I will not give any real names or locations on where this occurred, as I fear some of you might get the bright idea of trying to find this place for yourself. So it started over the summer. A few of my friends and I decided we wanted to go on a camping trip. Weird, right? For dudes going into the wilderness with no girls and sleeping in tents? Well, we used to do this when we were kids, so it was kind of a nostalgic trip. We hadn't noticed anything when we were teenagers. It would always be an annual night of fun in the outdoors. We would drink, tell stories, laugh, cry, the whole deal. We lived relatively close to the woods, so our parents would let us go up, but only once a year. So anyway, back on topic, it had been 5 or 6 years since we last went up there. We all parted our separate ways when we went to college. We would occasionally all go on Facebook to talk about our lives. So we all finished college, got jobs, and I decided to call them up. I managed to get a hold of 2 friends, and they were both up for it. My other friend moved all the way out to Florida, and he was busy with work and shit, so he couldn't come back to our home state. We brought a bunch of gear and supplies, as well as a couple of other things like beer and food. We were ready to relive our high school days as best friends. We got onto the trail at about 5 p.m. We hiked on the trail, and I swear it was like we were back in high school. We talked about everything happening in our lives. We were laughing so hard at the college stories we were practically choking. We finally got to our campgrounds at about 8 p.m. We were all set up by 9, and we lit up the fire and cracked open the beer. We told stories for about 3 hours, and we decided to call it a night. Now, there are many rumors in my area about these people in our area who have been isolated for some time now. We had never seen any sign of them when we were younger, so we had no reason to ever be worried about them. I don't know if they relocated or moved or something, but basically what I'm trying to say is they should have never been there. They should have never known we were there. I woke up in the middle of the night and looked at my phone. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and for some reason I couldn't sleep. For about an hour, I just laid in the tent just staring at nothing. That's when I heard it. Not it actually, that's when I heard them. It sounded like a pack of wolves or something walking about our camping grounds. I was already losing my shit at this point, but when I really shit myself was when I realized it didn't sound like animal breathing. The way the steps were moving and the breathing patterns were just too human that there was no way they were animals. I stayed absolutely silent. There was no noise for a brief period, and for a moment I thought I was just imagining it. Then I heard whispering. All I could make out was, after we gut them fuckers, who's gonna get their livers? At this point, my fight or flight instincts kicked in. It was officially go time. I decided that there were too many of them. I swear to God, now that I'm remembering it, there must have been a dozen of them at least. I nudged my buddy to wake up. He just turned around and looked at me with eyes that told me, what the actual fuck? I put my finger over my mouth and motioned with my hand that we needed to go. He nudged the other friend, and we could clearly hear them talking now. We all stayed absolutely still for 30 seconds, and I took out my Swiss Army knife. I took out my phone for my flash, and I was ready to bolt out there. Then I heard one of them scream, "Them F are awake." I immediately jumped out of my tent, and I got one good look at all of them with my flash. They were fucking disgusting creatures. Their teeth were all deformed and their heads were gigantic. Their ears were huge and perked up like dogs. They were all much bigger than us. I would assume they were all around 6 feet 4 inches. We left everything. We completely bolted out of the area as fast as we could. I could hear them all chasing after us for a couple of minutes. My adrenaline was at maximum levels, and I wanted nothing more than to get the fuck out of the woods. I could hear them cackling as they were trying to track us down. After 2 full hours of running downhill, we finally jumped in the car and called the police. We told them everything that happened. Here's what the cops said in response. You must have had an encounter with the nickname for group of people. They happen frequently in this area. Just don't go back there. What the fuck? I explained to him that they were about to skin us alive, and we left all our shit there. All he could say was, "I'm sorry for your loss, sir, but I would advise you to not go back." I was in complete shock. I have done a lot of research on the group of people the officer told us about after that incident. Some of the stories are horrifying. Many cases of missing men, women, and children, all leading back to this one group of people. The police refuse to infringe this group of people in fear of retaliation. There needs to be stop to this. A lot of nights I keep lying awake in bed thinking about what would have happened had I fallen asleep. I still think about it to this day. It has become very difficult for me to fall asleep after that, knowing that sleep could have let my guard down and gotten me killed. I don't know if you guys have any experiences like this. Feel free to discuss it in the comments. I just needed to get this off my chest. I haven't been the same since then, and I feel like this might add some closure. Have a nice day, everyone. 4th story. How I became a Wendigo. My name is Levi, and I'm 19. I live in the countryside of central North Carolina. I usually like to go on a walk in the woods after I get off work to relieve stress from working all night. Earlier this week, something strange made me question my entire reality. This is my story, the story of how I became a Wendigo. I was walking through the woods as I usually did after getting off work when I heard something ahead of me about 50 feet. I curiously walked over fallen logs and rotting leaves to investigate the noise I had heard. I instantly recoiled in horror at the disgusting sight laid before my eyes. There was a bloody corpse of a deer, its body almost unidentifiable with all the blood and insides splattered all over the fallen leaves. I regained my composure slightly until I realized I was getting hungry. I looked closer and realized that this dead thing was not a deer. I lost every sense of rationality as the hunger I felt enveloped me. I heard whispers in my mind as I suddenly realized my surroundings. It had grown dark, and I had blood on my shirt. I let out a horrified scream as I realized what I had done. The whispers I had heard were speaking to me again. I heard them say, "You ate the flesh of the cursed king. Now you will become the new cursed king. Rejoice, for this is the time of rebirth, the time of new life." I felt the world fall to black. I woke up to see myself in a circle of blood, surrounded by hooded figures wearing deer skulls. On closer inspection, it seemed as if they weren't just masks. They chanted in a language I didn't understand, and I started to scream as I felt unbearable pain. I was unable to move as their chanting only grew louder. I blacked out and woke up an unknown time later on what I could only describe as a bloody throne of bones, rotten flesh, and what looked like bits of hair. I was unable to move as I saw a vision of what I call a Wendigo ripped its head off and slammed it on my own. There are things that have been happening to me that I cannot explain. I cannot help this feeling of dread and extreme hunger I have. I want to eat humans. I have an insatiable hunger, and I cannot escape what I have become. I cannot explain what I have become. I don't know what I am going to do now. I felt extremely sick, and I passed out once more. As I slipped away from reality, I felt only pain and sorrow but could not cry in pain. I somehow woke up in my room, and I've decided to seek help with the last of my sanity intact. Please, if you know what's going on, I need help. I've already eaten 4 people, and I'm starting to grow antlers and grow fur. My hands are black, and my claws make it hard to type. Please, I'm begging you, if you see me while traveling in North Carolina, kill me. I am leaving as soon as I post this, so I don't hurt anyone else. It's too late for me now. 5th story. The Man in the Woods. The cabin was small and hidden deep within the woods, far from any road. It had a wood shingle exterior, 1 door, 1 curtain window, and a metal stovepipe sticking out from the roof. Along the side was a rack of logs and a stump with an axe stuck in it. On the other side was a line for hanging clothes. Think it's abandoned? I whispered. Justin shook his head. Nature ain't taken it yet. What do you mean? You ain't ever noticed that when people leave a place, nature moves in? All those plants in green that show up. Oh, yeah, like the old church. Just like that. And it don't take long, neither. Why does nature wait for people to leave? It don't wait, Cole. Nature's always trying to take over, but people won't let it. It's like a war or an invasion, one that never ends. Nature was here first, though. So, that means we're the invaders. We ain't been given a choice. Well, we could at least be nicer. Justin was quiet for a moment, then said, "Let's get a closer look at that house." We crept through crunching leaves, stopping every few steps to listen, then continued forward until we reached the side of the house. "What if they have a gun?" I asked. "Everyone has a gun out here." "Yeah, but what if they use it on us? We're just kids. They ain't gonna shoot a couple of kids. People have killed kids before. You worry too much." If they pull a gun on us, we'll run. Ain't nobody faster than us. We ain't faster than bullets. Justin peeked around to the front of the cabin and said, I'm gonna try the door. Wait, keep an eye out. Before I could say no, Justin rounded the corner and was at the door. I watched the surrounding woods for movement. With each passing second, I felt as if the homeowner was coming closer, but I was too anxious to tell if nothing was moving or if everything was. It was as if some invisible force were charging toward us. Cole, Justin whispered, startling me. He was peeking around the corner, waving me over. It's unlocked. I hurried to him, and we stepped through the open door into a small, tidy space. There was a neatly made twin-sized bed and a deerskin rug spread across the wooden floor. On the right side of the room was a wood stove with a pot on top, with a shelf above it that held various jarred herbs and spices. On the left of the room was a bookshelf holding about a dozen books, and next to that a wooden chest. Wow, I said. This is awesome. Let's see what's in that chest, Justin said, and knelt and opened it. He rummaged through, pulling out various clothes until it was empty. Nothing good. Check out these books, I said. Justin closed the chest, then looked over my shoulder as I pulled out books on gardening, hunting, bushcraft, and taxidermy. What's this one? Justin said, reaching past to grab a book with a blank leather cover. Is it a Bible? It's my journal, a deep voice announced from behind us, startling us against the bookshelf, causing several books to get knocked over onto the floor. The man was tall and looked to be in his mid-40s. He was clean-shaven and didn't look much like the sort of person you'd expect to find living hidden in the woods. Sorry, Justin said and held out the journal, and as he did so, a photograph of a young boy fell out. The man reached down and picked it up, looked at it for a moment, then took the journal from Justin and placed the photo inside. My son, the man said. He stepped toward us, and we moved out of the way as he placed the journal back onto the shelf, then knelt to pick up the rest of the books. Sorry, sir, I said, and helped him pick up the books. Justin did the same, then the man took the books from us and returned them to their shelves. What are your names? The man asked. We introduced ourselves, and he told us his name was Henry, then asked, Is this the first time you've seen my cabin? Yes, sir, we answered. Nobody else knows about it? Justin and I looked at each other, then back at Henry, and shrugged. We ain't ever heard anyone mention it, Justin said. Henry looked at us a moment, then nodded. Okay, don't tell anyone. He walked over to a bucket of water he must have brought inside with him and dumped some of it into the pot that sat atop the stove. Then he stepped outside. We should go, I whispered. Okay, Justin answered. We hurried to the doorway, and right as we reached it, Henry was there holding a rifle and a log. He looked at us a moment, then we moved out of the way so he could pass. He stepped through and leaned the rifle against the wall and placed the log into the stove. I'm going to make rabbit stew, he said, and began to make a fire. You're welcome to join. We need to get back home, I said. Justin hesitated, though, and asked, Why you out here? With the fire going, the man shut the hatch and stood and faced us. Because I want to be. Are you alone? The man nodded. What about your son? I asked. The man looked at me, then his eyes fell to his feet, and he said, He's dead. Oh, sorry. How'd he die? Justin asked. The man looked back up. He was sick. Where's his mom? The man shrugged. I don't know. We aren't together anymore. The water was beginning to boil. The man turned to it and began putting in different herbs and spices. Will one of you grab the rabbit from the stump outside? He asked. Justin stepped outside and Henry glanced over at me and said, Go grab some vegetables from the garden out back. Which ones? Whichever ones you like. Justin and I met on my way to the garden, and he said He doesn't seem so bad. I don't know. What if he's some sort of outlaw? Justin grinned. Maybe he's a bank robber. Or a murderer. Justin held up the skinned rabbit. This one might agree with you. Then he laughed and headed into the cabin. At the garden, I hadn't the faintest idea what I was looking at. Everything looked like weeds, aside from the tomatoes and peppers. So that's what I grabbed. Here you go, I said as I stepped back inside and handed Henry the veggies. No potatoes or carrots? He asked. I didn't see any. They're under the soil. Oh. Henry smirked and took the tomatoes and peppers from me and said, well, let's see how Cole's stew turns out. Underscore 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 underscore. That evening, we sat around the cabin and ate the spiciest rabbit stew I'd ever had. For a second there, I'd even thought we'd been poisoned. But Henry just laughed and said I'd picked something called a habanero pepper. What kind of psycho eats this stuff? Justin said as he gulped down a second cup of water. Sorry, boys, Henry laughed. I should have warned you. He stood and grabbed another jar and said, try this. It might help cool you off. What is it? I asked. Honey. I was desperate, so I quickly took the jar and stuck a spoonful in my mouth, and sure enough, it seemed to help. Justin snagged it from me and did the same, and before long, we'd cleaned out that entire jar of honey. Look at y'all, a couple of Pooh Bears, Henry joked. Sorry, I apologized. I'll get you more. I appreciate that, Cole. Henry stood and took our dishes from us. It's getting dark. You boys better head home. We agreed and thanked him for the honey, and I apologized for ruining the rabbit stew. Henry shrugged and said, I liked it. Might make more for myself sometime. That next morning, I was up in my room when I heard a commotion coming from across the street. Justin and his dad were shouting at each other, and shortly thereafter, Justin came storming outside. I quickly opened my window and hollered for him, and he looked up at me and said, Let's get the hell out of here, Cole. I put on my shoes and hurried down the stairs and past my mom and sister, who were sitting on the couch watching the morning show. Where you off to? Mom asked. Gonna go hang out with Justin. Be home before dark this time. I will. I mean it. Justin was waiting for me outside. We bumped fists, and he said, Let's go see what Henry's doing. Right now. You got anything better to do? I shrugged. No, I guess not. Hold on a second. I hurried back inside and into the kitchen and grabbed one of those bottles of honey that's shaped like a bear, then ran out the door again as my mom said, Hey, were you taking my honey? I looked at Justin and yelled, Run, and we took off for the woods. As we walked through the woods, Justin went on about what an asshole his dad was and how life would be better if it were just him and his mom. I wasn't so sure if it would be better or just another kind of awful, considering his mom was a useless alcoholic. But at least she didn't hit him. She wasn't always a drunk, you know? Justin said, That's why I wear this necklace. It was a shark tooth necklace I'd never seen Justin without for as long as I knew him. Nothing impressive. You can find one in any beach gift shop. They weren't together for a while. My mom and dad, Justin continued. They'd broken up. Before you knew me. Mom and I were happy back then. We went to the beach one day, and she bought me this. We couldn't afford much, you know? But we didn't need much. Or at least I didn't think so. Why'd they get back together? Mom thought we needed more, and Dad could afford it. He's the only reason we're in that house. I guess that ain't all bad. We wouldn't be friends if you weren't in that house. Justin smiled and patted me on the back. You're right, Cole. But never knowing someone is okay. Losing someone you knew is what's hard. Henry was sitting in the doorway reading a book when we arrived. Back so soon. Brought you some honey, I said. Henry held out his hand, and I tossed it to him. He looked at it and smiled. Thank you, Cole. What you reading? Justin asked. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Ever heard of it? Justin shook his head. I'm not much of a reader. Henry looked at me and I shook my head as well. What's it about? I asked. It's about two friends, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. They get into a bunch of trouble and go on adventures and such. It's sort of a kid's book. Henry closed the book. I started reading it again because you two remind me of the main characters. Cole, you're like Tom, and Justin here is like Huckleberry. What kind of name is Huckleberry? Justin asked. Henry shrugged. Same could be said about Justin, or Cole, or even Henry. What kind of name is any name, really? We hadn't a clue, and noticing he confused us, Henry laughed and said, So, what can I do for you boys today? I guess we're just looking for something to do. Henry put the book down and scratched at his chin. Y'all know how to chop logs? On that day, Henry taught us how to chop logs and start a fire, and over the next couple of years we'd sneak off a few days each week and bring Henry food and supplies in exchange for lessons in self-sufficiency. He taught us things like how to work with wood, garden, hunt, skin an animal, and cook. We'd also check out books for him from the library, and when he finished one we'd spend the following night sitting fireside as he told us all about what he'd read. Henry became like a father to Justin and me, and that made me and Justin feel more like brothers. Justin was 16 when he told me his plan. I want to introduce Henry to my mom. What? Why? I asked. Maybe they'll hit it off. But your parents are still married. I know. I'm hoping if Mom meets Henry, she'll fall in love with him and leave my dad. You don't even know if Henry is her type. How can he not be? He's single and nice and way better than my dad. That don't mean she'll fall in love with him. It don't work that way, Justin. You even said that the only reason your mom got back together with your dad is because he had money. Henry doesn't have any money. Justin thumbed at the shark tooth necklace. Henry can show her that we don't need money to be happy. He can help her remember. Part of me didn't want it to happen because I wanted Henry to be my dad. I would have been jealous. But I also knew that Henry wasn't just living in the woods. He was hiding. For whatever reason, he didn't want to be found. That night there was an argument across the street. It was violent and it was loud. Glass was shattered and doors were slammed, and in the morning, Justin was gone. I'd gotten used to hearing from Justin every day. If I didn't see him, he'd call me over the walkie-talkie. This was the 90s. We weren't using cell phones. So I went to his house that following afternoon and knocked on the door. Something I was always hesitant to do. His dad answered and just looked at me. Is Justin home? I asked. No. I haven't seen him all day. His dad shrugged. Not my problem. But he's your son. Excuse me. I swallowed and said, Sorry, I meant that you'd know better than anyone else. Well, I don't. Before he shut the door, I noticed that the rug that was usually spread across the living room floor was gone, and there was a new hole in the wall about the size of a fist. That had me concerned, but I decided I'd check with Henry before telling my mom what I saw. So, I made the long walk through the woods alone to Henry's house. White smoke was billowing from the chimney as I arrived and knocked on the door. Henry opened it and said, Hey, Cole, come on in. I stepped inside and could smell that he was cooking a stew. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but you're probably not going to want any of this stew, he said. How come? He lifted the pot off the stove and showed me. It's your spicy rabbit concoction. I smirked. No thanks. Well, if you change your mind, I have plenty of honey. Henry went back to stirring. Where's Justin? I was hoping he was here. Henry stopped stirring and looked at me. You can't find him? No. I haven't seen him all day. That's not like him. No, it ain't. But I heard his dad hollerin' last night, and when I went to his house a couple hours ago, there was a big hole in the wall and the living room rug was missing, and his dad said he ain't seen him all day. Henry sighed and sat on the bed. Have you told your mom? Not yet. I wanted to see if he was here first. Can you think of anywhere else he might be? I shrugged. No. He was planning on coming out here anyway. Without you. I don't know. Maybe. He wanted to try to get you to meet his mom. Henry furrowed his brow. Why? He thought if she met you, she might fall in love and leave his dad. Henry smirked and shook his head. Oh, Justin. That poor boy. I watched Henry for a moment, then asked, would you have married his mom? No, Cole. I don't know her, and even if I did, my marrying days are over. This is how I'm going to live until I die. Alone. Henry nodded. What do I do now? Henry stood up and took the pot off the stove, set it onto a cinder block, and tasted the stew. If you tell the police and Justin becomes a missing person, there will be search parties looking all up and down these woods. They'll find me. So, finding Justin is more important. I'm a wanted man, Cole. It was the first time I'd heard him admit it. He truly was an outlaw. What did you do? I asked. Henry put the spoon down and walked over to the bookshelf, pulled out his journal and removed the picture of the young boy and looked at it. His name was Sean, your son. I lied when I told you he was sick. He wasn't sick. He was murdered. A man took him when he was walking home from school. He took my son, locked him in a cellar, and tortured him until he died. Sean was only 10 years old. I'm sorry, Henry. I knew who did it, but the police thought differently. They said there wasn't enough evidence. But I knew without a shadow of a doubt it was him. So, I did what the police couldn't. I killed him. Henry turned and looked at me. And, for that reason, I can't let them find me. I was shocked that Henry was even capable of such a thing. Okay, then what do I do? Henry placed the photograph on the bookshelf and sat back on the bed. You need to either find Justin or find proof that his dad killed him. But you need to move quick, before someone files a missing person report. Justin's dad owned a contracting business. Some days he worked long hours. Some days he barely worked at all. It was impossible to gauge when he would and wouldn't be home. So the following morning I watched by my window until he left, and the second he did, I hurried across the street. The door was locked, as I figured it would be, but I knew the same couldn't be said about Justin's bedroom window. There'd been plenty of times when Justin snuck out that window in the middle of the night and, likewise, I'd also snuck in a handful of times. The latch was broken. It was easy. I entered as quiet and careful as I could and looked around Justin's room for any clues. It was messier than I remembered, and the door had been knocked off its hinges. But what stood out most to me was that his mattress was missing. Nothing else seemed out of place. I stepped into the hall and crept carefully toward the living room, keeping an eye out for Justin's mom as I went. The first thing I noticed was that the walls had more than one hole punched into them, and the furniture was all scattered about. It looked like Justin's dad had gotten into a fist fight with the room itself. Again, I noticed the missing rug and knelt and smelled something like bleach, and as I looked even closer, saw what looked like 3 drops of blood. All the clues were pointing to the worst. I crept over to the kitchen and opened the fridge. Lots of beer. I closed it and looked at the counters. There was a knife missing from the wooden knife block. I was almost certain now, but I had to check 2 more spots, the garage and the master bedroom. The garage had a freezer, and my heart trembled at the thought of what I might find in it. First, I looked around behind tool chests and whatnot, and finding nothing, I walked over to the freezer. Please don't be in here. I whispered to myself, then lifted the lid. There wasn't anything inside but deer meat and ice cream. I sighed with relief. Then, all of a sudden, the garage door began to open. Without a second thought, I hurried back into the house and didn't get far before I was face to face with Justin's mom. She blinked at me a few times, then groggily said, "Hey, Cole, where's Justin?" At that moment, the interior garage door opened and Justin's dad stepped inside. "What the hell are you doing here?" he said. "I'm looking for Justin. He's not here. I told you that already." "Where is he?" "I don't know." "Yes, you do." His dad's eyes got big, and he said, "What are you trying to say?" "You killed him." "I know you did." "Boy, you better watch your mouth." "What's he talking about, Chris?" Justin's mom asked. "Shut the fuck up, woman." I backed up toward Justin's mom and said, "He killed Justin. And if you don't leave here, he's going to kill you, too." Chris pointed his finger at me and stepped closer. "I'll kill you, boy. That's who I'll kill if you don't get out of my house right now." "Fuck you." Chris charged at me and Justin's mom pushed me out of the way and screamed, "Get out of here, Cole." Then she pulled at Chris long enough for me to run out the front door, and whether that was enough, I don't know, because I just kept running without looking back until I reached the woods, and even then, I still hurried until I got to Henry's cabin. I didn't bother to knock on the door this time, and when I got inside, Henry wasn't there. It was quiet and everything was tidy. I sat on the bed and caught my breath, and noticed that the rifle was gone. He must have been out hunting. I sat there a moment, waiting for him, and noticed the photograph of his son still sitting on the bookshelf from the previous night. It seemed dear to him, not something he liked to share. But I was curious, so I picked it up and got my first real look at the boy. He looked to be about 10, the age Henry said he was when he died. He didn't look much like Henry. He was blonde-haired and blue-eyed, whereas Henry had dark features. There was something about his smile that seemed forced. His eyes didn't look happy. In fact, he looked kind of scared. But there was something else. Something in the background that was out of place. It was Henry's cabin. That didn't make sense. Henry moved to the woods to escape the law, a law he didn't break until after his son died. How could his son have been here? I dropped the picture and pulled Henry's journal from the shelf and opened it. It wasn't a journal at all. It was a photo album, each page a photo of a different child. I felt the room start to spin. I had to leave before he came back. I turned around to go out the door and stopped. There he was, standing right in front of me. "Hi, Cole," he said. He looked at the book in my hand. "I see you looked at my journal." "I didn't look at it." "No? Oh, well, then let me show you." "That's okay. I've got to go." "Nonsense." Henry shut the door. "Stay a little while." Then he tapped the bed with the butt of his rifle and said, "Have a seat." Reluctantly, I set the book down and did as he asked. He stepped over to the bookshelf and picked up his journal, then sat next to me on the bed. He carefully opened it to the first page. "This is my collection, Cole. They're in ascending order by age. Page 1, you can see, is an infant, little baby Andy. Page 2 is 1-year-old Tessa." He flipped the page. 2-year-old Abigail, or Abby, as her parents like to call her. "Please, I don't want to see any more." Henry sighed and flipped a few pages to age 9. And next to it was a blank space. He placed the photo of the blonde-haired boy under age 10. Michael had gotten lost in the woods. He found me, just like you and Justin. "Where is he?" "Justin? Oh, let me show you." Henry flipped past ages 11 through 15 and stopped on 16. It was a picture of Justin bound to a chair in a dark room. He was a fighter, I have to admit. I felt sick. Tears started to swell in my eyes. Justin had been betrayed by the man he trusted most, And at that moment, I had not only lost my best friend, my brother, but I'd also lost another father. Now, Cole, don't cry. I'll let you see him. You can say goodbye. He's alive. Henry pointed at the floor. He's down there. Show me. Henry closed the book and stood, then lifted the deerskin rug, revealing a hatch door. He opened it, and a rotten odor lifted into the cabin. He motioned with his hand to the dark hole in the floor and said, "After you." I stood and looked down into the hole. I don't see anything. Henry reached under his bed and grabbed a flashlight and handed it to me. I shined it down the hole and could see a ladder descending about 20 feet to a dirt floor. "You go first," I said. Henry frowned. "Cole, whether you go down or not, I'm the one controlling this situation. I choose whether you live or die." I stared at him a moment, knowing what he said was true, and leaned over the hole and yelled, "Justin." No answer. Why isn't he answering? Henry shrugged. Maybe he can't hear you. I couldn't take not knowing anymore, so I stepped to the ladder and descended. To my surprise, Henry followed. "Justin, you in here?" My feet touched the dirt floor, and I looked around the room with the flashlight. It was empty of all except a chair in the middle, and slumped over in the chair was Justin. I hurried over to him and lifted his head, and when I did, it fell back, and I could see that his throat had been cut, and the ground beneath him was sodden with blood. "Sorry, Cole. I needed 16. He trusted you. And were those 2 years not some of his best?" I looked at Justin's lifeless body, the shark tooth necklace, his symbol of hope, still hanging from his neck. "Are you going to kill me next?" "Well, I already have a 14. Henry opened the journal and took out the picture and looked at it for a moment. Then he tore it in half and said, "But it looks like I need a new one." He dropped the journal and rushed toward me, and right before he reached me, I yanked the necklace from Justin's neck and stabbed the shark tooth straight into Henry's eye. "Fuck," he cried, covering his face, blood seeping between his fingers. I sprinted past him and up the ladder, and before I got to the top, he grabbed a hold of my ankle. I kicked several times and managed to connect with his bloodied face, knocking him to the ground. Then I heaved myself up from the hole, slammed the hatch shut, and piled everything I could on top of it. I watched for a moment as he tried and failed to push through. Then I grabbed his rifle and took off for my house. The cabin was so far back in the woods that the police asked me to take them to it. My mom went with me, and around noon, we reached it. We stayed back as the police moved forward with guns drawn. But as they entered the cabin, I could see that the hatch was now open. They never found Henry. He left behind everything except his journal. I recently went back to the old neighborhood. Most of the houses have been sitting empty for over 20 years. I suppose people weren't comfortable with the idea that Henry might still be in those woods. And now that everyone is gone, nature has moved into all of their homes. All except for one. Justin's dad stayed, but not his mom. On the day of Justin's funeral, I gave her a gift. A necklace. One which reminded her of a happier time. In the woods is a spot where the cabin once stood. In its place, a cross memorializing where so many children lost their lives. Nobody knows for sure how many children died there. At least 6, as that's how many bodies were found buried in various spots around the cabin. Around the cross are several mementos placed there by loved ones, a toy car, a girl's hair ribbon, a teddy bear. But on the day I visited, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. A copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Inside was a handwritten message, which read, "See you soon, 38. Tomorrow will be my 38th birthday. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.